The evening air was thick with tension, heavier than the usual summer heat that Margaret had grown accustomed to. The sky was streaked with gold and deep crimson, and shadows stretched long across the garden, making familiar shapes look strange and unfamiliar. Margaret had spent the day preparing the house for what she thought would be a quiet night, the kind of evening where she could sit by the fireplace and let her thoughts wander freely. Yet something in the air told her that tonight would be different, though she could not yet name why. Eli arrived as he usually did, silently appearing at the edge of the garden. Margaret noticed immediately that he moved with a subtle urgency, a tension in his shoulders that she had not seen before. He did not smile, did not offer his usual calm greeting. Instead, his dark eyes seemed to search for something, and when they met hers, there was a weight in them that made her chest tighten. She felt a shiver pass through her, not from cold, but from anticipation and an unnamed fear. "Margaret," he said quietly, stepping closer than he normally did, "we must speak. It cannot wait any longer." His voice was low but firm, carrying a seriousness that made her pause. Margaret felt her pulse quicken, unsure whether to feel excitement or apprehension. She nodded slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she gestured for him to follow her toward the small porch, where the evening light softened the edges of the world. Once seated, Eli did not immediately speak again. He leaned back slightly, his gaze fixed on the horizon as if trying to see something beyond the visible, beyond the town, beyond even the evening itself. Margaret watched him in silence, feeling the weight of the moment pressing against her. For weeks their interactions had been quiet, gentle, and measured. Yet now there was a shift, a turning point where unspoken feelings and hidden fears seemed to converge. Finally, Eli spoke, his voice carrying a gravity that made Margaret hold her breath. "I have something I must tell you," he said, "something that cannot remain unsaid. You must know, Margaret, that I am not like the people you trust or the neighbors who live quietly in this town. My life has been complicated. I have made choices that have forced me to live in shadows, to move quietly, to avoid attention. And yet, despite all that, I find myself drawn here to you, because I see in you something I have not seen in many years: honesty, courage, and the strength to endure what most would crumble under." Margaret's heart pounded. She had sensed that there was more to Eli than he had revealed. But the reality of his words brought a mixture of fear and curiosity that left her nearly breathless. She wanted to ask questions, to probe for details, but something in his gaze stopped her. There was no deceit there, only a quiet, unwavering sincerity. She began, struggling to find words that felt adequate. "I do not know what to say." Her voice was small, almost lost in the heavy air, yet it carried the truth of her feelings. She had not known until this moment how deeply she cared for him, how much his presence had begun to matter. And now that he spoke openly, she felt both relief and terror. Eli reached out, his hand hovering near hers, not touching yet, but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "You do not have to say anything," he whispered. "Only know that I'm here and that I care, and that my care is not fleeting, not shallow, but something that has grown with every day I have spent near you." His words were simple, yet they carried the weight of months of unspoken connection. Margaret felt her chest tighten, a lump forming in her throat as emotions she had buried for so long threatened to overwhelm her. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the garden around them bathed in the soft glow of twilight. The world seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that something significant was unfolding. Margaret's mind raced with questions about his past, about the dangers he hinted at, about the intensity of her own feelings. But another part of her, the part that had learned to endure, to survive, to trust cautiously, urged her to simply feel the moment, to let herself exist fully in the presence of someone who cared. Finally, she allowed herself to take his hand. The touch was tentative at first, a gentle acknowledgement, and then firmer, more certain. She felt the strength in his grip, the steadiness that mirrored the quiet resolve she had come to admire. And in that moment, the tension that had lingered between them for weeks seemed to dissolve, replaced by a profound connection neither of them could deny. "I am afraid," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Afraid of what I feel, afraid of what your life might bring to mine, afraid of letting myself care." Eli squeezed her hand gently, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "Fear is natural," he said softly. "But love, connection, care, these are worth the risk. You have endured so much, Margaret, and yet you are still here, still capable of feeling, still capable of hope. That is what makes you remarkable." His words were simple, yet they resonated deeply, echoing within her like a promise she had longed to hear. The evening deepened, the stars beginning to appear one by one, scattered across the sky like tiny sparks of light. Margaret felt a warmth spread through her, a combination of relief, desire, and cautious optimism. She realized that she had been holding herself back, protecting herself from pain, yet in doing so, she had also protected herself from joy. Now, with Eli beside her, she felt the possibility of both. As the first star blinked brightly above, Eli leaned closer, their faces inches apart. Margaret's breath caught, her heart racing as she felt the intensity of the moment. There was no rush, no demand, only the steady presence of someone who cared deeply and sincerely. And then gently, cautiously, Eli pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was soft, deliberate, and full of unspoken words. Trust, longing, understanding, and care. Margaret felt a shiver run through her, a mixture of fear and exhilaration, as if the world had shifted slightly on its axis to allow this moment to exist. When they pulled back slightly, their foreheads resting against each other, Margaret felt tears welling in her eyes, not tears of sorrow but of relief, of release, of a deep recognition that she was not alone, that she had allowed herself to feel again. Eli's eyes, dark and steady, met hers, and in them she saw the same mixture of fear and hope, the same understanding that this moment was fragile and precious. The night seemed to wrap around them, the garden alive with the quiet sounds of rustling leaves and distant night birds. For the first time in months, Margaret felt fully present, fully alive, and fully capable of embracing the connection that had grown between them. The kiss, gentle yet insistent, had shifted something deep within her, breaking through the layers of grief and solitude she had carried for so long. Yet, even as the warmth of the moment surrounded them, there was an awareness of reality pressing softly at the edges of her consciousness. Eli's past, the dangers he had hinted at, and the life he led beyond the town were all factors she could not ignore. But in that moment, none of it mattered as much as the truth that had blossomed between them. A truth that whispered of trust, care, and the fragile yet undeniable power of human connection. They stayed together in the garden for hours, speaking little, simply enjoying the presence of one another. Each movement, each glance, each quiet touch reinforced the bond they had developed, a bond built on patience, respect, and the slow unfolding of understanding. Margaret realized that the most meaningful connections often grew quietly, in small moments, in gestures that seemed ordinary but carried extraordinary weight. When Eli finally rose to leave, Margaret felt a pang of longing, a wish that the night could stretch forever. He looked back at her, his expression calm but serious, and she felt the full weight of his unspoken promise that he would return, that their connection was not fleeting, and that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Margaret watched him walk away, the fading light casting long shadows across the garden. She felt a mixture of anticipation, fear, and exhilaration coursing through her. The turning point had come, the moment that shifted the trajectory of her life, and she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The grief that had defined her existence for months was still present, but it was no longer all-consuming. It had been tempered by the warmth of connection, the thrill of possibility, and the quiet certainty that love, in its simplest form, could arrive when least expected. And as the stars sparkled above and the cool night air settled around her, Margaret felt something she had not felt in a long time, a sense of hope, a sense of belonging, and the fragile, exhilarating possibility that life could once again be full of beauty, even after loss. The days that followed were a delicate mixture of routine and curiosity. Margaret found herself glancing toward the garden path more often than she cared to admit, wondering if Eli would appear again. She told herself it was foolish, that she had no right to expect anyone. Yet a small spark of hope began to take root in her heart. The house, which had once felt like a quiet prison, now held the faint possibility of life beyond sorrow. Even the air seemed lighter when she walked through the garden, her steps carrying a little more spring, as though the memory of Eli's presence had somehow lingered among the roses and the freshly turned soil. It was a warm morning when he returned, just as silently as he had appeared the first time. Margaret was pruning the hedge along the edge of the property, the sun already high enough to burn the dew from the grass, when she saw him standing at the gate. He nodded once, a simple greeting that carried no ceremony, and then walked slowly toward her. She felt a flutter in her chest, a combination of excitement and caution, as she straightened her posture and watched him approach. "I thought I would check on the fence," he said quietly, his eyes briefly scanning the garden. It looked as though it might need more work. There was no question in his voice, no demand. Just a quiet assertion that he had returned. Margaret nodded, unsure what to say. "Thank you," she said finally. I appreciate it." She realized as she spoke that her voice had grown warmer, softer, carrying a tone of acknowledgement that she had not allowed herself for many months. Eli smiled faintly, not in triumph, but as if he understood something she had yet to realize about herself. "It is no trouble," he said. "Perhaps in doing this I help myself as well." His words puzzled her, but she sensed sincerity in them. There was an honesty in his presence that was rare, a steadiness that seemed to balance the fragile world she had built after her husband's passing. They worked together quietly, Margaret handing him nails and a hammer while he carefully measured and aligned the wooden boards. The silence between them was comfortable, not awkward, carrying a rhythm that was almost musical in its steadiness. Every now and then, Eli would glance at her and she felt a strange awareness, as if his eyes could see through the walls she had built around her grief. She tried not to meet his gaze for too long, but when their eyes met, she felt a warmth that made her chest tighten and her hands tremble slightly. As the sun moved higher in the sky, a breeze swept across the garden, lifting stray strands of Margaret's hair and carrying the faint scent of the nearby wildflowers. She inhaled deeply, feeling the heat on her skin, the weight of the day pressing lightly against her shoulders, and yet something in her chest felt lighter. The routine that had once been so lonely now held a small, comforting energy, the presence of another person, steady and real, filling the air with a quiet vitality. For several days this became their new rhythm. Eli would appear at the edge of her property, offering to help with chores or repairs, and Margaret found herself accepting more readily than she expected. She had grown used to solitude, to the stillness that had defined her life, but his presence brought a small sense of excitement, a feeling she had not experienced in months. She began to look forward to the moments when he would arrive, wondering what he might say, how he might move, what small gestures might break through the layers of her quiet despair. Yet, as their time together grew, so too did a sense of tension. Margaret felt a mixture of anticipation and fear. She had not intended to allow anyone into her life, had not wanted to risk the vulnerability that came with human connection, and yet with each visit, Eli's presence chipped away at the walls she had built around her heart. She found herself laughing softly at his quiet observations, feeling her pulse quicken when he handed her a tool or brushed a strand of hair from her face. Each small action seemed to carry weight far beyond its simplicity, stirring emotions she had long believed were buried forever. One afternoon, as they repaired a section of the fence that had been weakened by storms, Eli paused and leaned against the wooden posts. His hands were dusty, his shirt damp with sweat, yet his expression was calm and steady. "You work too hard," he said simply. "Even strong women need rest." Margaret looked at him, unsure how to respond. His words were not criticism nor judgment, but a gentle acknowledgement of her endurance and her struggle. She felt a faint blush rise to her cheeks, not from shame, but from the realization that someone was noticing her efforts, noticing her, not just her work, but her presence, her strength, her quiet courage. I manage," she said softly, though her voice lacked the firmness it once held. "I must." Eli's eyes met hers, steady and unyielding. "And yet you are human," he said quietly. "Even the strongest need someone beside them, even if only for a moment." Margaret looked away, feeling the truth of his words pressing against her. She had spent months alone, surviving, enduring, and now she realized that she had been missing more than companionship. She had been missing connection, understanding, and the simple comfort of another person noticing her, truly noticing her without expectation or demand. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing visit, their bond grew stronger, though unspoken. Eli never forced conversation, never pressed too closely, but his presence alone seemed to invite Margaret to share her world, her thoughts, her small daily triumphs and challenges. She began to tell him about the garden, about the flowers that refused to bloom, about the stubborn weeds that grew where they should not. He listened attentively, asking questions only when necessary, his focus entirely on her words, his respect evident in every gesture. Yet the town began to notice the change as well. Whispers followed Margaret through the streets. People commented on her lighter step, her brighter expression, the faint smile that occasionally touched her lips. They did not know why, and Margaret did not tell them. Some said it was curiosity. Others said it was the beginning of healing after loss. Margaret herself did not know what it was, only that she felt alive in ways she had not for months, and that her heart, once heavy with grief, was now capable of hope. Despite the growing warmth between them, Margaret also felt a pull of fear. Eli was mysterious, and she knew little of his past. There were moments when he would disappear for hours, leaving her alone in the garden, and she could not help but wonder where he went, who he was beyond the fence and the gentle words he shared. She wanted to ask, but a part of her feared the answer, the possibility that he was not the safe presence he appeared to be, that his life carried dangers she could not comprehend. And yet another part of her could not resist him, could not deny the excitement, the thrill, the stirring of emotions she had long buried beneath grief and solitude. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of pink and orange, Eli and Margaret stood together by the newly repaired fence. He rested a hand lightly on the top plank, and she felt an unexpected warmth at the touch. It was not intimate, not demanding, only present, steady, and reassuring. They watched the horizon in silence, listening to the distant sounds of the town and the rustling of leaves in the wind. For a long moment it seemed as though time itself had paused, leaving only the two of them, the garden and the quiet magic of shared presence. Margaret began, then stopped, unsure what she could say. Words seemed inadequate, yet the need to speak was strong. I did not expect this. Her voice was soft, hesitant, but honest. Eli turned to her, his dark eyes steady. Neither did I, he said quietly. But perhaps some things are meant to arrive unexpectedly, to remind us that life continues, even when we believe it has stopped. His words were simple, yet they resonated deeply, echoing within the hollow spaces of her heart. Margaret felt her chest tighten, a mixture of fear and longing. She wanted to trust him, to allow herself the comfort and companionship he offered, yet the memory of loss lingered, a shadow she could not fully escape. She looked away, her gaze drifting to the flowers at her feet, the soft petals trembling in the evening breeze. Eli did not push, did not demand. He simply stood beside her, a silent presence that spoke louder than words. And in that moment, Margaret realized that the most powerful connections were not built on force or urgency, but on patience, understanding, and the quiet acknowledgement of another soul. The days continued in this delicate rhythm. Work, conversation, silence, and shared presence. Margaret began to feel her world expand again, little by little, as if the garden itself mirrored the growth within her. The fence, once broken, now stood firm and straight, a symbol of strength and resilience, much like the changes occurring in her own heart. And though challenges remained, whispers of the townspeople, questions she dared not ask, fears she could not yet overcome, Margaret began to trust in the quiet promise of connection, in the possibility that life could offer more than sorrow, even after loss. With Eli's presence, the empty rooms of her house seemed to hold warmth. The garden seemed brighter, and her heart, once heavy, began to beat with anticipation, curiosity, and hope once again. The evening was quiet, more quiet than Margaret had expected. The sun had dipped low behind the hills, casting long shadows across the town, turning the streets into bands of gold and brown. The air carried the faint scent of wildflowers mixed with the heat of the dust, and Margaret found herself standing at the edge of her garden, brushing dirt from her hands. She thought she had grown accustomed to solitude, but that evening the silence felt heavier than ever. It pressed against her ears, her chest, and even against the walls of her large house. As she was about to turn inside, a sudden sound made her pause. It was soft at first, almost as if it had been swallowed by the wind. Then there it was again, a slow, deliberate step on the gravel path that led to her porch. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. She had lived in that house all her life, yet the unexpected sound sent a ripple of unease through her. She stood frozen, her hands tightening against the small trowel she had been using, and waited. From the shadows appeared a man she had never seen before. He was tall, with a strong build, and there was a careful quietness in the way he moved. His clothes were simple, slightly worn, but he carried himself with a certain dignity. His eyes, dark and watchful, seemed to take in every detail of the garden, the house, and Margaret herself. She could not tell if he was friend or stranger, harmless or dangerous. Something in the way he stood, the stillness around him, made her both curious and cautious. "Good evening," he said, his voice low, calm, and measured. Margaret noticed it immediately. There was no hint of anger, no rush in his tone, only a quiet strength that commanded attention. She hesitated before answering, unsure of what words felt safe to speak. "Good evening," she replied cautiously, keeping her hands at her sides. The man nodded slightly, as if acknowledging an unspoken rule of manners. He did not step closer, but he did not retreat either. There was a strange weight in the air, a tension that made Margaret instinctively want to close the door and retreat inside, but something about his presence held her there, rooted to the spot. It was as if his silence spoke louder than words ever could. "I am Eli," he said finally, offering a slight bow of his head. Margaret studied his face carefully. It was rugged, marked by lines that spoke of hard living but not unkindness. His eyes were steady, observing, and for reasons she could not explain. They seemed to see more than just her outward appearance. They seemed to touch the quiet sorrow she carried within. Margaret swallowed, feeling her throat dry. "I am Margaret Hollis," she said, unsure why she felt the need to introduce herself to a man she barely knew. Her voice sounded smaller than she intended, almost swallowed by the growing evening shadows. Eli nodded again, this time almost imperceptibly, before turning his gaze toward the garden. "You take care of this place well," he said quietly, almost as if to himself. His words were simple, yet the tone carried a weight of meaning. It was not flattery, it was observation. Margaret felt a strange flutter of emotion, an acknowledgement that someone had noticed her efforts, her presence, her life that had become so lonely. "I do what I can," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "It keeps me busy." She wondered why she felt compelled to explain herself to a man she did not know. Eli remained silent for a moment, then pointed toward the far end of the garden. "The fence there looks damaged. I can fix it if you like." His words were plain, practical, and yet there was an undercurrent of offer, of presence, of intrusion into her carefully guarded world. Margaret was startled. She had not asked for help, yet there was something in his calm confidence that made it difficult to refuse. That is kind of you," she said carefully, "but I can manage." Eli shook his head slightly, a faint smile touching the corners of his mouth. "Sometimes it is better to accept help," he said simply. "Even strong women need it." Margaret felt a mixture of surprise and irritation. Strong? She had spent months surviving on her own, managing grief, keeping her life in order. The suggestion that she needed help was both unwelcome and oddly comforting. For several minutes they stood in silence. Margaret watched the way his hands rested lightly at his sides, the careful way he shifted his weight, and the way his eyes seemed to measure the garden as though they had a story of their own. It was the kind of silence that carries meaning, that stretches beyond the need for words. She felt an unexpected tension in her chest, a strange curiosity she had not felt in months. Finally she spoke. "If you must," she said slowly, "you may repair the fence, but I will not pay you." The words were firm, even as her heart betrayed a tiny thrill at the thought of another person moving in her space. Eli's eyes softened. "No payment is needed," he said. "It is a favor," perhaps to balance the silence. Margaret tilted her head, unsure what he meant, but there was no malice in his words, only an honesty she found difficult to resist. The next hour passed in quiet work. Eli moved with careful precision, examining the broken wood, measuring and adjusting each piece with a skill that suggested experience. Margaret lingered nearby, pretending to busy herself with her own chores, though she kept glancing at him. There was something mesmerizing about the calm focus in his actions, the way he did not rush, and the way he seemed completely present in the moment. As the sun dipped further, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Margaret felt a strange shift within herself. Her heart, which had become accustomed to emptiness, now fluttered in a way that startled her. She had spent months existing quietly, moving through her life as if behind a veil, and yet here was a man who had entered her garden, uninvited yet not unwelcome, bringing with him a sense of life she had forgotten. "I did not mean to intrude," Eli said at last, breaking the silence. "It is just that this fence..." It needed care, and I know how it feels to see something neglected." His words were simple, yet they carried weight, and Margaret found herself considering them, thinking of the house, the garden, and the quiet emptiness she had endured for so long. "You have intruded," she said quietly. "But perhaps it is not unwelcome." Her own words surprised her. She had been wary, cautious, and yet there was a part of her that recognized the truth in his presence. There was life in the way he moved, in the quiet strength he carried, and in the way he had noticed her, truly noticed her. For perhaps the first time in months, they stood together as the evening darkened, the soft light of the setting sun fading into the deep blues of night. Margaret realized, with a mixture of fear and fascination, that she was no longer holding herself apart from another human being. Her solitude, once a shield, was beginning to crack, and in its place, something new was stirring, something that whispered of possibility, of curiosity, of connection that went beyond mere politeness or town gossip. When Eli finally straightened, brushing sawdust from his hands, Margaret felt a strange reluctance to see him leave. "I will come again," he said quietly, almost as a statement rather than a question. "I know this town and I know this house, and perhaps I can help again." Margaret nodded, unsure why she did so, feeling a warmth she had not known in months. I will be here," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried no demands, only a quiet promise. And then he walked toward the path that led back to the road. Margaret watched him go, his silhouette blending into the evening shadows, and felt an unfamiliar stirring in her chest. She returned to the house, her steps lighter than they had been in weeks. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it a sense of anticipation she could not explain. Something had changed. The stillness of her life, the careful solitude she had built, had been interrupted, not violently, not rudely, but quietly, persistently, in a way that made her heart beat faster than it had in a long time. That night, Margaret sat by the window staring into the darkness, imagining the stranger walking down the road, his figure swallowed by the night. She realized she had not felt this alive in months, not since before the grief, not since the world had narrowed to her empty house and silent walls. And though she did not know it yet, that brief encounter, that quiet presence in her garden, had set something in motion, a story that would not leave her, a life that was beginning again in ways she could not yet see. For the first time in a long while, Margaret did not feel alone. Margaret Hollis had never imagined that her life would become so quiet, so empty, so full of silence that even the walls seemed to mourn with her. The summer of 1927 was harsh, with the sun pouring its heat across the small frontier town where she and her husband had built a life together. The streets were dusty, the air heavy with the smell of dried grass and wood smoke, and the horizon stretched out like an endless canvas of pale gold. Every morning, Margaret would wake in the large bedroom they had once shared, the sheets cool against her skin but her heart hot with memories she could not escape. She would sit by the window watching the sun climb slowly, feeling the emptiness press against her chest like a weight she could not lift. Her husband, Thomas Hollis, had been the town's banker, a man of order and responsibility. People trusted him with their savings, their letters, and sometimes their secrets. Margaret had always admired the way he carried himself, careful and deliberate, a man who understood the value of patience and quiet dignity. But Thomas had died suddenly, leaving her standing alone in a house that had once echoed with laughter and conversation. The day the news came, a neighbor had tapped gently on her door, her eyes soft with sympathy. Margaret had nodded, accepted the kind words, and closed the door behind her. She had walked through the halls as though in a dream, touching the furniture, the photographs, everything that had belonged to both of them, and feeling the weight of absence in every corner. The townspeople were polite, offering condolences that were always slightly awkward, words that tried to fill a void that nothing could reach. Margaret walked to church on Sundays, though she could barely remember the hymns they sang together, and she would sit in the back pew, hands folded in her lap, feeling as if the whole congregation existed on the other side of a thick glass wall. She did not speak to them more than necessary, and the few conversations she did have felt hollow, like echoes of the life she had once known. Even her closest friends seemed to shy away, unsure how to speak to someone who had lost everything. Days passed slowly. Margaret would rise with the sun, dressed in the soft, somber clothes that had become her armor, and move through the house like a shadow. She tended the garden out back, her hands digging into the dry soil, pulling weeds that grew stubbornly even in the heat. Sometimes she would pause and feel a pang of longing, remembering how Thomas had knelt beside her, showing her how to plant seeds evenly, explaining patiently how to care for the roses and the small vegetables they grew to eat. But those memories brought both comfort and pain, and more often than not, she would shake her head and return to her chores, trying to fill the hours with motion so her mind would not wander too far into sorrow. Her evenings were long, stretched thin like the shadows that fell across the wooden floors. She would sit by the fireplace, a book in her lap, but her eyes rarely followed the words. Instead, she listened to the soft crackle of the flames, the occasional creak of the house settling, and the distant sounds of the town preparing for night. Sometimes, when the wind blew through the trees outside, it carried with it a loneliness that pressed against the windows and slipped into her heart. Margaret had grown used to it, the way sorrow could become a companion, persistent but silent. The house itself seemed to mourn with her. The doors groaned when opened, the windows rattled with the slightest gust of wind, and the walls held a chill even in the height of summer. Margaret could not remember the last time she had heard the sound of her own laughter, or the last time she had felt lightness in her chest. Friends came and went, offering food or small gifts, but she always thanked them politely and sent them away, unable to share the emptiness that had become a part of her. The walls had grown familiar to her grief. They absorbed her whispers, her sighs, her quiet tears that fell when she thought no one was watching. Yet, amid all this stillness, Margaret did not completely close herself off to life. She would walk along the edge of the town, past the small shops and the empty fields, feeling the sun on her face, tasting the heat on her lips. She watched the children play, their laughter light and careless, and felt a pang of longing she could not name. There was a world moving outside her doors, a world that did not stop for sorrow, and sometimes she felt a small stir of curiosity, a hint of something like hope, even if she did not fully understand it. Her evenings often ended at the small parlor window, where she would sit, hands clasped tightly, staring at the fading light. The stars began to appear slowly, one by one, as if someone had scattered them across the sky with care. Margaret would watch them, feeling the quiet hum of life beyond her walls, and sometimes she whispered Thomas's name into the dark, as if the wind could carry it to him, wherever he might be. She spoke little to others, but her heart remembered everything. The sound of his voice, the warmth of his hand in hers, the way he had smiled at her in the sunlight streaming through the kitchen window. Those memories were a comfort she could not release, even if they brought tears. The townspeople began to notice small changes in her behavior. She moved more deliberately, spoke more softly, and spent hours alone in the garden, her hands busy, her mind quieter than ever. Some said she had become part of the house itself, a ghost walking among the furniture and the memories. Others whispered about her resilience, her dignity in the face of tragedy. Margaret did not mind the whispers. She barely noticed them. She lived for the moments when she could move through the garden, when the wind brushed against her face, when the house itself was silent enough that she could hear her own heartbeat. Margaret had learned to carry her sorrow with grace. Though it pressed on her like a constant weight, she avoided places where memories were too sharp, faces that reminded her too vividly of the past. She walked carefully through her days, as though stepping lightly across glass, afraid that any sudden movement might shatter the fragile balance she had built. And yet, even in the midst of grief, she could not entirely shut the door on curiosity. There was a part of her that longed for something beyond the walls, something alive and unpredictable, though she did not dare name it. Every day blended into the next, each hour marked by chores, small walks, and quiet reflection. Margaret had made a careful routine, one that allowed her to survive without feeling too exposed to the world outside. She spoke to neighbors only when necessary, accepted letters and gifts with polite nods, and returned to her solitude without complaint. But sometimes in the deepest part of the evening, when the world was quiet and the stars shone cold and distant, she felt a stir in her heart, a question, a flicker of longing for something she could not yet define. In that long, quiet summer, Margaret Hollis became a woman defined by patience and grief, yet also by resilience. She was a figure of silence in a bustling, dusty town, a woman whose life had been turned upside down by sudden loss. Yet beneath the stillness there was a spark of something waiting, something that would arrive one evening like the whisper of wind before a storm, something that would make her realize that even in grief, life could still surprise her in ways she could never imagine. And though she did not yet know it, that spark was already stirring beyond the walls of her house, moving closer with each passing day.